okay, this isn't Summoning Insight, but it's a new series we're going to do here. And the kind of the seed behind the idea was when we did our end of year awards, everyone else who does end of year awards either did them totally wrong and they gave it to all the wrong players, or people just don't do them. Like, there's not a lot of official bodies really do them, they're just kind of just community things. And so I wanted to be like this might sound arrogant, believe it or not, but a group of experts should come together and decide who the best people are. Because I'm sorry, I don't want to get into a whole life philosophy thing, but that's actually the best system in life for deciding how good things are. Get the most informed people and ask them. That's just the best system, okay? So in line with that being the best system for doing like year awards, I've always thought like Hall of Fames are a good idea. Now, if you've noticed, in every single area of Hall of Fames, in different, whether it's music, whether it's sports, admittedly the music ones tend to be like not such a great concept the way they execute them, but the sports ones particularly, a big part of what makes them interesting is obviously it's a way so that when a person comes up so that they're going to be in the Hall of Fame, then you kind of revisit their career and you talk about what they were great at. And crucially, then there can be debate over like, should someone be in a Hall of Fame? Do they meet different metrics and merits that would value someone to be in a Hall of Fame? So we're going to do our own, for now, League of Legends one where we're going to take people in. And so the concept behind it is going to be like a real Hall of Fame thing. We're going to explain like what qualifies the person to be in the Hall of Fame. What were they really good at? Then we'll discuss things about their career that kind of celebrate what they were good at. And also, like a Hall of Fame, we're not going to have it like in real sports where, since sports last so long, your career, they have like rules. Like you have to be retired 5 years and then, there's all these different sets of rules. If we do that in League of Legends, no one's going to actually be watching this because League of Legends will have ended by the time we get to put most people in. So we're going to have to put in people who might still be playing. But I'm still going to try and roughly go like within the kinds of orders that you should go in, Like we're not just going to put Faker in tomorrow, even though he might be the best player, because there's lots of players before him who should be in the Hall of Fame, So in general, we're going to keep it a little bit chronological in that sense. So as a result, I thought today's person we're going to put in is like a great one to start with, because it's an instant lock. If you tell someone that criteria, that we're not just going to put like the newest people in now, then the first person who has to go in a Hall of Fame is the guy on the left box here, MadLife, right? Monte. He's like the first. He's the first ballot Hall of Fame lock out of everyone in League of Legends history, right?
Yeah, him or Wei Xiao, probably, in my opinion.
But at least MadLife's known by people in the West, Monty, who watch League of Legends, and they can still watch him now, So, okay, so let's do the criteria kind of like how I explained there. The first thing we have to do is establish why would MadLife be in a Hall of Fame, Before we can celebrate his career and talk about what he's wonderful at, we have to explain some of the basics. So in real Hall of Fames, they always start, first and foremost, actually, just purely with numbers, etc. And some Hall of Fames, I think, only go off numbers almost, So just based on, like, accomplishments and things like that, I mean, for people who haven't watched old school League of Legends, how would you define his accomplishments?
Well, I mean, basically he started on a team called Maximum Impact Gaming, MIG, back in the early days of League of Legends, and won his first tournament under that banner. Well, actually, they were Azubu Frost by the time that they actually won, but their first season, they made it to the finals, lost to Blaze, and they were the first. Blaze and Frost were the first two really dominant teams in Korean League of Legends history, as a lot of fans know. And they went on to be quite dominant, generally speaking, around the world before they had a little bit of a falling off later in 2013 and in 2014. But probably for the first year, because remember that they won the On-Game Net Invitational, the first like kind of mini tournament that OGN had, coming in to League of Legends when they first started having basically League of Legends tournaments. And then from there went on to 2 consecutive finals, winning one against CLG EU, and then getting second at Worlds, and then made a third final right after Worlds as well, losing to Snajin's Sword. So they were, a very accomplished team.
I mean, in that scenario there, Monty, you can really make the case that, okay, they only won one tournament, aside from the Invitational you're talking about there, in terms of like big tournaments, they only won one like major tournament there. But they made the finals of all 4 of the first major tournaments they played. And crucially, because they made the final of all 4 of the first major tournaments, that in their own way, you could debate whether they were even the best team of the year. You know, they were definitely the most consistent, displayed the most excellence at the biggest stages.
It is worth noting that, so if you count the OnGameNet Invitational, Azubu Champions Spring in 2012, Champions Summer in 2012, the World Finals, and Champions Winter 2013, they did make 5 consecutive tournament finals. And they won they won 2 of them, but that's still an insanely impressive feat for the time.
And then beyond that season, okay, so you're thinking there, guys, like, right, well, they have this insane, they always made finals, they could never lose before the final, but then after that, they dropped off and they went to shit, right? No, then they made the next 2 semi-finals, then they made the round of 8s after that, and they only finally dropped out making round of 8s, like, last season. So they just, like, the level of consistency as well over history is just crazy with this team.
Not to mention that they also won an NLB in 2014 in the spring. This was after they had made some changes to their roster with Swift and Coco, and were actually looking on the up and up. And interestingly, in that season of NLB, which kind of decided who was 5th place, so by winning NLB, they were sort of 5th place and champions. They beat SK Telecom K in the semifinals of Champions, and then beat Najin Sword in the NLB final as well. So they had a really solid run, even in the spring of 2014. It was only summer 2014 that they sort of had a disastrous drop off.
Okay, so here's the strange thing, okay, man. I think that alone, just those accomplishments, show that, like, as in terms of team success, this guy's obviously up there. He's in one of the most successful teams ever. Not necessarily in terms of pure winning tournaments, but just sheer. That's the thing that people also have to understand when you judge how good players are. Yeah, you go with whether they won the tournament initially, but that's like stage 1 criteria. Stage 2 criteria is, well, how did you do in other placings in tournaments? Because that sets up the rest of your resume, you know, how consistent, how good you were. So probably one of the best resumes ever in terms of just consistency of high placings. There's going to be very few people are going to have that level, and for so long. So now that you've set up kind of like how accomplished the team are, within the team, we have to define this was like a star player. Like, yeah, later you'd have Shai would have a very good period. Aside from that, this was basically the star player of all his teams, right? This is the guy who just set up a lot of the things within the teams, who kind of led a lot of the aspects of the team, the vision control and things like that.
Yeah, he did. And I just want to talk about, too, in your latest, like, Thorin's Thoughts video, or one of your more recent ones, you talk about kind of evaluating players' careers and consistency, and it kind of looking at the surrounding cast of players on the team as well. And I think you talked about Frost in that video a little bit, and saying, like, MadLife and Shai were the 2 kind of big carries or big star players on that team. And I think you have to keep that in mind, too, because if we look at MadLife's career, he started out with Loco Doco as an AD carry who was never really exceptional in any way, and bounced around a bunch of teams, like not doing a whole lot. And then you move into, they change Woong from a top laner to the new AD carry, who is one of the most bizarre AD carries in League of Legends history, you know, famous for building warmogs on his AD carries and flashing into team fights. I mean, he really wasn't a high damage output AD carry and was more of a meat shield than anything else. It was very weird, but it was actually functional because of how well Frost team fought. And sure, he had Shai, but I mean, his kind of Cloud Templar was a very passive jungler, wasn't giving his lanes a lot of help typically, and was a great team fighter, but didn't really show up until the late game most of the time. And then he never really had a very strong mid or AD carry player. I mean, the mid laners, first we had Rapid Star, then it kind of devolved into like Mach Noon and Gank by Mom. And then Coco was good. Coco's probably the best mid laner he's ever had. But AD carries, Space is doing well now, but it's taken Space a really long time to get decent. And otherwise, it was kind of like Woong and Hermes and a kind of a revolving door of AD carries besides that. So I think what's interesting about Frost is that they were able to get so far with kind of not a great supporting cast around Shai and MadLife.
I mean, on that point, okay, yeah. Obviously, first of all, the first credit you have to give to that overall is that it means they were a great team and they had complementary pieces and they had great synergy and they had a great strategical man. That everyone who knows team sports knows that those factors will get you ahead of teams who might mechanically be better than you and might have better players at individual positions. But kind of what you're implying there is that really shows the level of someone, especially someone playing a support role, which you have to realize during this guy's star days was before support was ever really tanking, was ever really a position with a lot of items. So he's playing by far the weakest position in the game. The position that in theory was supposed to have the least impact on the game overall, as in from the individual respect. And yet, like Monty's saying here, this guy played with so few star-level carry-type players. He just mainly played with serviceable players in the carry roles. And so it really kind of hints at the fact, if you haven't watched him play, well, he obviously did some really special stuff and he could exert game impact that other players just couldn't from his position, you know, because even star players who were at the support position in other regions, you know, every single one I could think of had some superstar carry, usually had like a good AD carry or some god at another position, you know. So it's rare that you could be that good and have such a success when you're stuck in this position here. So what set him apart from other support players, Monty? Because if I say the mechanics, like, yeah, his mechanics were really, really good, right? That's the first thing everyone always goes to. Everyone always says, like, oh, his mechanics were as good as a mid laner or a top laner or something. Is that overselling it at all? Do you think back then his mechanics initially at least were?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. His mechanics were, I think, by far the best in his position at the time. And that doesn't even go into his decision-making and his vision control and everything like that. And I think what you say is really important because, crucially, we have to remember what the metagame was at the time when MadLife was great, because MadLife's peak really came at the end of Season 2 and about the first 6 months of Season 3. I would say was when he really hit like the high watermark. So this was like before really the rise of SK Telecom, but sort of post, like including Worlds and Champion Summer, and then like post Worlds before like Faker shows up and starts getting really huge in Champion Summer. And like at this, because they kind of went downhill for a while at the end of 2013 and early 2014. And perhaps right now are seeing some sort of renaissance, but we'll jury's still out on that one. 2 games are not enough information. Anyway, but looking at the meta at the time, you have to remember that supports were pretty much just buying wards back then. Riot hadn't implemented a lot of systems for passive gold generation in lane that we saw kind of come into play, especially during Season 4. A lot of money was going into consumables with oracles, elixir, and a lot of these wards. So he didn't, like you're saying, he didn't really have items, really, which made kind of what he did even more extraordinary because he couldn't get cooldown reduction to like get more grabs in there or, you know, have his abilities up more frequently to use them. So he really had to make them count in a way that other supports couldn't. And I think that's really what it was MadLife's insane accuracy with his mechanics, with his skill shots, and his playmaking ability, and his team's ability to follow up on that too was really extraordinary and different because no other support player could really even live through attempting to do the kind of things that MadLife could do. He was very aggressive and very calculated, and also just kind of guaranteed to land those skill shots.
So when you talk about MadLife mechanics, the first champion we're going to obviously have to highlight is Blitzcrank. Now, for everyone who plays solo queue, and they've had their time. I'm just going to say they've had their time, Monty. Like maybe they've moved past it in bronze and silver. But if they've existed in bronze and silver, they'll know that Blitzcrank is still a thing down there, Monty. People still use it. And not only that, they dumpster down there with it. So people might naively think, well, you know, a lot of people can use Blitzcrank. A lot of people play that. When MadLife was the god of Blitzcrank, very few other pro players consistently picked this champion. They were going with like the Sona. They were going with like Alistair. These sorts of things, you know, they weren't... What else would have been around back
Soraka.
then? Yeah, those were the most obvious ones. People weren't picking Blitzcrank and they weren't using it as a playmaking champion. That's the key thing. But part of the reason why is because other people could not land these grabs the same way that MadLife could. What would you say about his Blitzcrank?
I mean, insane play, and that contributed to his vision control as well, because you really have to have that vision in order to make the Blitzcrank plays. So MadLife was one of the first support players to really get good deep warding into the enemy side so he could play forward with Blitzcrank and kind of make those aggressive plays. And so it wasn't just his accuracy with skill shots, but it was his forethought with how he was going to make those skill shots by warding, which is something that really, I mean, it sounds obvious now, but he was very innovative in the way that he controlled vision and denied the enemy team vision and kept himself in the black while playing Blitzcrank so the other team wouldn't expect these grabs coming in. And when we talk about MadLife too, we really have to talk about 4 champions. And those champions are Blitzcrank, Thresh, Alistair, and to a lesser degree, Sona. But these are going to be the big four that he always used, and that most of his impressive plays come in on.
I mean, when you say that about the Blitzcrank scenario there, like setting up these plays, etc., that's another thing. This is an area where I feel like if someone came in before the middle part of 2013, they'll have a real hard time understanding this concept, because I think essentially MadLife's plays trickled out through League of Legends, and now every support intuitively understands the concept of creating plays just because of MadLife to a degree. As in, everyone now who plays Thresh is looking for plays, and they're looking for when can I set up my combo and go in lane. And these sorts of things, to a degree, weren't done as much back as a support then. Your job was bodyguard the AD carry, keep people off him, like heal him, whatever, shield him, whatever specific champion you had. Whereas that's part of MadLife's genius as well, was he had that kind of sense that like great sportsmen have, where, you know, people will always use those cliches, Monty, of like, oh, time slows down for them, or they knew what the opponent was going to do. They don't really. It's more like they just have an incredible kind of visual sense, a sense to visualize rather what can be done, and then just like instantly act on it. So it's sort of like, it's not even like they construct it like an engineer, but it's like they can sort of sense like, oh, this is possible, and then they can do it, you know. And so part of that is kind of like you have to be able to do your crazy part of the play, and you have to have some sense of what the enemy might do, or what you'll do in response to it. And so if you watch someone like Faker make insane outplays now, you see this now, but this guy was doing it from the support position without a very good AD carry and creating like plays that can keep your lane going, or you can start a fight, right?
Not only without a good AD carry, but because of the way Cloud Templar played, like literally no jungle pressure in the laning phase. Cloud Templar would not gank. You know, he was great at farming and making plays later on, and he was a fantastic team fight initiator. And that was really Frost's strength, was of course their 5v5 team fighting. But yeah, this was like in the early days, he really didn't have any help at all. Also, Rapistar was a very passive mid laner who didn't CS very well. Like there were issues, but they really made it work. And I think what's really important to remember too about MadLife is that without any changes to the actual balance of the game, he almost single-handedly turned the support position from a reactive only position, like you're saying, protect the AD carry, into an active playmaking position. And that really came, like you're saying, with Blitzcrank, but also, as you alluded to, his Thresh play as well. Because he was the first player, I think, to really unlock the potential of Thresh. And Thresh plays that look, I'm not going to say normal, because they're still amazing even today, but more normal in terms of like flash lantern poles, flash hooks before they removed the ability to like start your hook, then flash, and like finish the animation afterwards. Like Riot took that away mostly, I think, because of MadLife actually. So that those like playmaking abilities with Thresh and the way to combo Thresh's kit and the ability to like flay people out of movement animations, like jumps, like Zac jumps and stuff like that, like we saw with Mock Noon. When he had that insane Thresh play onto him, and his team's willingness to follow up on his shot calling was really impressive. And so that was like a big, I think, watershed moment for support players in general, because even though I think Mata is a better player than, like Mata in his prime, I think was better than MadLife. I don't know if Mata could have existed without MadLife breaking that ground in terms of vision and mechanics in the first place.
Well, I mean, here's the way I define the two of them, Monty. Here's my Thorin analogy for you, okay? So if we imagine that MadLife is like a jazz player, he's coming up with like interesting riffs on what he's doing, and he's breaking new ground. You know, he's like a Miles Davis, John Coltrane type guy. He's really breaking new musical ground. Instead, MadLife is the guy. Mata is the guy. Did I say MadLife for the first one there? Did I say
yes?
Mata? Okay, so MadLife's the jazz player, but Mata is the player who comes along who isn't that much into jazz. He's not much into like insane improv, but he just takes the musicianship, like the craft of how well you can play the music, to such a high level. He can play all of the jazz guys' music, and he can play everyone else's music, and his levels at the highest level in all aspects of the musicianship, you know. Whereas the thing with the MadLife guy we're talking about here is, especially in his era when people weren't doing this, it was like revolutionary, the kinds of plays he was setting up. I mean, before I just go into Thresh here, just on Blitzcrank still, there are so many highlight videos of him hitting blind hooks in professional games that get a key grab during the game. Like when someone thinks they're safe running away through the jungle, which are 100% blind, and which I feel like almost ruined Blitzcrank as a champion when scrubs play him on solo queue. Because every scrub wants to do that and thinks to himself, like, that's... People even used to do that back then, Monty. MadLife was the original champion that used to tilt me when the video would come up on Reddit and people would start their analysis where it'd be like, well, of course, that's just a blind hook. He just threw it, a grab rather. He just threw it out randomly. He didn't know. It's like, it was in a pro game and he had to land that to make the play. Like, it wasn't solo queue where you do that 100 times and the first 99 times you're like, hey, if I'd have got him, and then you run away. Like, he had to land it there, and he did. And part of it also was he did have an uncanny sense for knowing which way people would dodge, right? We should mention that on Blitzcrank.
And also on Thresh, he would, like, his flash predictions, I mean, he would just know exactly which of your abilities and summoners were up, and he would predict your flashes. I mean, there are crazy examples. I mean, probably the most famous one is when Wonsuck, this is interesting. So there was a game that Frost played against Mig Blitz in Champions Summer 2014.
Yeah, it must have been since Moon went to
I'm pretty sure.
Korea, America at the end of 2013. So it must be, yeah.
No, Mig Blitz. This was the new Mig.
Yeah, but wasn't he the coach of that?
Yeah.
So if he was the coach and he went with Loco Doco to Quantic, that must have been at the end of 2013. So it must be the summer season.
Yeah, summer season.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Anyway, there was this game against Big Blitz where Wonsuck, a player named Wonsuck, who you may know better now as a player named Pawn.
Unless you're an LCS caster, in which case you don't have any. Keep going. Just had to throw that in there, Monty.
Anyway, Pawn was in this Big Blitz game, and there are tons of highlights you can find of this. But Pawn was playing Ezreal at the time, and MadLife walks into lane, and Wonsuck like flashes, and MadLife perfectly predicts his flash as he's running away and manages to get the hook and kill him. And it's like, that's not the only play that MadLife has done it, but that was probably the most amazing time that he did it. And so it's just plays like this that are really impressive and that are very much highlight worthy. And if we talk about MadLife too, I think that if you're trying to rank him among like player skill during his time, I think that probably during the first half of 2013, he was probably the best player in the world before Faker kind of took that mantle towards the end of Champions Summer and had really kind of proved himself in terms of his consistency. At the end of Season 2, I would have said that the best player was Wei Zhao. But I think that MadLife for about 6 months was probably the best player in the world. And ever since Champions Summer in the middle of 2013, it's been Faker.
Well, for the purpose of this episode, Monty, we'll just allow that premise to exist and we won't get into a debate over who was the best player in the world in the spring of 2013 in Korea. we won't start that debate, okay, because that one could last a while. So anyway, accepting your premise there, when we're saying all this, also being able to predict flashes and crucially also with Ezreal, who has like his own mini flash with the E, he was insane at predicting the arcane shift as well and knowing where he would go to.
There's another good example of that, which is Doublelift playing Ezreal at All Stars in 2013, where he was laning against MadLife, and they ended up in the mid lane, like the duo lanes ended up in the mid lane, and Doublelift dies a bunch of times in lane, and tons of arcane shift predictions with MadLife's Thresh hooks. I have no idea how MadLife got Thresh in that game, but it was a pretty big dumpstering of Doublelift.
And people always, that was another area where people would kind of like break it down, but in a way that I always thought like was a bit unfair. So, you know, with the normal way I always criticize that sort of like fan analysis where they say it's not a good play, is that they make the mistake of thinking, well, I have done that. Whereas they don't realize the pro player did it in his one chance when he had to do it now. Like he didn't have a bunch of times to fail, you know. In the same world, okay, people would always make comments whenever he would do these flash predictions. Like, first and foremost, they'd say like, oh, well, he just like, he knows he's probably going to dodge, so he just guesses which way. Yeah, you're right, he guesses, but he's not just guessing blindly. That's the key point to make here. He's very good at guessing. These are calculated guesses. And on the same level, okay, I've seen people intelligently break down some of how he set the flash predictions up in a way that reminded me of when Crepo was at All Stars last time, and he explained Froggen's use of Anivia. You know, he would explain how Froggen had that revolutionary use of the wall, where instead of trying to block you off with the wall, he just tried to funnel you with the wall. So he'd try to funnel you the direction he wanted you to go, so he could then land, obviously, the difficult to land combo with the skill shots of Anivia. It was the same scenario here. MadLife had certain plays where after the fact, when you can slow the frames down, you can see like, oh, he was setting it up so he knew if the enemy had gone to the right here, his teammate was going to get him and it was the kill anyway. So he purposely wouldn't have thrown the hook there because he knows we're going to get that anyway. But if I throw it to the left where he has to try and dodge, then I've got an excellent chance of catching him. When, it was kind of set up that way. But the key thing I'm pointing out there is you can only figure that out as a normal human after the fact when you look at all these factors. He's doing it on the fly, impromptu, Think about how fast the flashes do. You don't have time to set all that up in your mind. Like, well, of course, if he was to go to the right, like, that's like some Kennedy magic bullet shit. Like, he's doing that on the fly. That's what made it incredible that you could do this. And I have to say, I can't think of any player I've ever seen in League of Legends who had that good flash prediction in any sense, actually. There was great players. Listen, that's the other thing. There was some players... I think we had an interesting discussion when we had, I think it was when Lord Loco was on the show and he was talking about Deft, where he was saying that to him the amazing thing about Deft's skill shot dodging was that he looked at Deft and he thought as an AD carry, like Deft actually isn't like predicting these, he's just reacting to them. He just has that insane reactions, when he sees something coming. Whereas the scenario I'm talking about here is, MadLife is predicting, he hasn't just got godlike reactions and he does it. There's also an element of like anticipation of what could happen and then kind of like going into that. But I actually also feel like, as a weird side topic, Monty, isn't that to a degree something you could put down to why a player like that might not be as godlike anymore? Because I've always felt like the most dangerous skill to have is an intuitive skill, because it's like you're reading the game and it's like you're reading the Matrix, okay? You're just getting all the information you need and every time you're making the correct decision. The problem is if that sort of skill falls off or just isn't as applicable anymore, you can't fix that, because it's not something really learned. It's like almost like there's something innate about that, right?
No, I mean, I know MadLife did a lot of work because he was famous for like memorizing cooldowns and stuff like that as well, which is why he could make a lot of these predictions, because he did have that information and he did work hard for it. It's difficult to pin down, I think, MadLife's falling off. I think that part of it was a lot of the other supports like learning so much from him and starting to catch up. But I think also it was partially a loss of motivation over the long run due to whatever factors. And also, I think you can't, like, you have to say that when the old Frost fell apart and they had to start replacing Rapid Star and Woong and Cloud Templar, that the pieces that they selected, at least initially with GBM, who is now quite a good player actually, but it took a long time, and Maknoon moving him to the mid lane, and that bizarre kind of like 3-man mid lane rotation that they had, and also putting Helios on Frost were really unsuccessful changes. And only after they got Swift and Coco did things start to look up again. But then Coco, after spring in 2014, he was not very meta resilient, and once his kind of Nidalee LeBlanc got nerfed, he wasn't very good in the 2014 summer season again. So it's been kind of a long and rocky road, and I think part of MadLife's individual performance has also been his kind of changing AD carries as well, and the fact that a lot of these other AD carries, like Deft, like Imp, proved to be significantly more skilled than anything that MadLife had to work with.
What's also interesting, if we go beyond, so obviously Blitzcrank, in terms of Thresh, we covered a lot of that, but I think probably the best example that sticks out of the Thresh play is that one that actually is from after Woong. So I think it was in the summer season, was the one where he has the play with Hermes. I think it's actually on Blaze. Let me think. So maybe it was the spring season then, because they played them in the semis then.
The double semifinal, which is, by the way, guys, if you have not seen those games and you have a hankering to go back and watch some Season 3 games, back in Champions Spring in 2013, semifinals were actually two best.
No, that's Winter, Monty.
Oh, that was Winter, yeah. But those games are amazing.
No, those were a full 5-game series, yeah. But no, I'm meaning the spring one. It's the one where he had Hermes as AD carry. You know, the one where he's on the river but down by Dragonside, and he makes that flash lantern play where he catches a hook. I think it's onto a Blaze player, from what I remember. I think it might even have been Flame. And then he brings in Hermes on the lantern, and he boxes, and then he basically just literally caught someone as a support rowing in the river and just created the entire play himself without even having anyone there. Which is this at least at that point in time, that was like mind melting shit that someone could even do stuff, and against elite level players also. We're not talking about like against the bad teams that he does a highlight, So in terms of the other champions, because actually a lot of people won't have seen these champions played, Alistair and Sona. Now Alistair, MadLife's probably the first one to like perfect that combo, right? Like the run in and headbutt combo.
Well, I don't know if he was the first one to perfect it, but like what really comes to mind with me against with MadLife's Alistair is, well, we talk about kind of MadLife's revolution using Blitzcrank and Thresh from changing the support position with its relative lack of items during that period from a more passive position into a very active and playmaking role. For me, Alistair's a continuation of that, but instead of just like those big mechanical plays, what he did on Alistair was he would single-handedly bring games back from behind through roaming. And he was probably like the first great example of a roaming support where if things were going well in lane, he would literally just leave Woong under the tower and start like walking into mid and top lane and making plays with Alistair to get players like Shy, like Rapid Star fed. And his initiations too, using the Alistair ult and like you're saying, the combo were fantastic. So for me, when we do see great roaming players these days like Mata, that is a product of what MadLife innovated using Alistair most significantly, because he would hard carry games on Alistair. Like they would be losing all their lanes and he would just leave and turn the entire game around instantly.
And obviously on Sona, the main play for everyone has always been the flash crescendo. And he was a great skill shot player, so that was money in the bank, right?
Yeah, that's why the Sona play is generally less impressive, because he tended to stay in lane, and like flash crescendo is not the most mechanical play you can make. It's about waiting for that proper window in order to use it. And also, yes, he was good at engaging, but you have to remember too that the primary engage force on Frost, at least while Templar was there, was always Templar. So him having that big flash crescendo is usually more of a follow-up to what Cloud Templar was doing. And he was very good at it, but it's just not quite as revolutionary, I think, as the other three champions that we really identify with MadLife.
But what's interesting, though, when I think about his context of in his era of his prime Season 2 and early Season 3, is that he would get these powerful champions that he was really good at. But if you think about it logically, it's because... Okay, here's a weird counterintuitive point. Okay, you'd think you're always going to try and take the best champions away from the star players of the opposing team, but that's also because the majority of star players in League of Legends history are the main laners and the main carries, okay? So usually you want to take their champions away because they're also the most powerful, and then on a carry main lane type person, they're going to also have the most impact. So actually, part of the reason I think why MadLife always had certain champions open was because you're not just going to spend 2 or 3 target bans on the fucking support, because then even if Rapistar isn't some god, even if Woong isn't super duper, Woong gets exactly the champion he wants, he gets his Caitlyn or whatever, or Rapistar gets exactly what he wants. So you had to pick your poison, Do you give the lesser player his best champion, or do you let MadLife have his best? And so people sometimes would choose to let MadLife have a Blitzcrank, etc.
Or even worse, you let Shy get something like Jax, right? There are definitely the thing about giving MadLife some of these playmaking champions is you're taking a risk. Like you're like, okay, well maybe MadLife will make a play, maybe he'll make a play, or maybe he won't. But if you give Shy Jax, the odds that he's going to hard carry the game like go up astronomically. Where that's like a thing where you can give somebody something. And they don't have to play an amazing game to be a really powerful presence on it. But if you give MadLife Blitzcrank, there's no guarantee he's going to have an amazing game. And, not all of his Blitzcrank games were amazing, just many of them, and most of them probably. But there's no guarantee that he's going to have that amazing game. So you might as well take a risk there as opposed to giving something that's kind of like guaranteed going to be powerful.
So in terms of like... So we kind of talked a bit about the vision control aspect there and his hooks and all these sorts of things. If we've mentioned those 4 champions, 3 of those champions are almost never used now. Like they've either been Sona's been reworked anyway. But in general, you very rarely ever see Alistair. You don't see Blitzcrank.
Alistair's still very useful, and the thing is that he was powerful, but he was used in the top lane at Worlds because he was banned nearly throughout the entire Worlds this year. But that was mostly because of his presence in the top lane. But even going through the summer, Alistair was a really, really strong pick, and he continues to be viable. So I wouldn't say that so much about Alistair, but Blitzcrank is like way too high risk because the thing is now people know how to ward better, and so Blitzcrank is a lot harder to pull off. And also people know how to lane better, and he really is not very good in the laning phase. So it is a bit rare to see him, but Wolf played him recently and won, so...
But I mean, in general, the champions you think of on MadLife, a lot of them fell away. There's Thresh, that's about it. Is that a factor as well? Was he just not as good on some of the newer champions? Like,
He
what,
wasn't,
like,
no.
what was the Nami like of MadLife? What were these other champions
not
like?
good. Out of like the new kind of wave of support champions, I would say MadLife's best pick is probably Braum.
What about Leona?
Yeah, I mean
Leona, right?
yeah. He's a pretty good Leona player, but Braum is pretty good. One thing that he did do, just kind of as a sidebar, is he was also one of the first players to introduce high AP mid laners into the support role very successfully, and he mostly did this by playing support Lux. And then I think this led to a lot of players like Mandu playing support Zyra, and these champions that were intended to be mid laners that have sort of become supports. And having that, because one thing that Frost was always really good at was poke compositions. And the other thing is that back when Rapistar on the team, Lux was one of his best champions and was a very large flex pick for Frost. And so they could select it early without fear and have MadLife play it if push came to shove. And that style of get a lot of AP on your support and poke in lane and actually become more of a damage output, I think transitioned into the thought process of other players picking similar styles of champions later on.
So we're going to go into my hypothetical realm that I always have. I've always got access to it, Monty. It's like I've got like a TARDIS that we can go and enter at any point in time. So the big thing about MadLife, and one of the things that makes his career amazing, is when you talk about his lane partners, and we say that his early lane partner was like quite a weak player. Now listen, the thing that was always undersold about Woong that you saw once he left was he clearly did have a strategical sort of footprint on the game. He clearly had some role in it in that sense, and he knew to a degree how to play within his role. It's not like he was a bad laner, but he was a moron who was just going to go super aggressive. No, he kind of knew that. He knew who he was, and he knew he was playing with MadLife crucially as well. So okay, it's not quite as bad as it initially sounds, but with that said, MadLife had one of the best careers ever for a support, but without ever playing with a dominant AD carry. Now, the hypothetical, obviously, Monty, is going to be what everyone always wondered. What would happen if you'd have put him with a good AD carry? Now, let's not go crazy. You can't, like, the same way as when we once had a discussion, okay, when I asked you what you thought of, like, Deft in the summer, and you, after the summer finals, and you told me, like, well, he could be better. And I was like, well, how could he be better? And you were like, well, if he had Mata. And I was like, well, that's cheating, isn't it? Because you can say that about every great AD carry. So you can't cheat like that, MadLife. Like, you can't just give MadLife Wei Zhao or, like, Prime Season 2 Double Lift. Just give him a good AD carry, okay? Someone with like some skills who could be aggressive in lane, make some plays. Maybe give him Prey, or give him someone maybe even a little bit of a level below that. Just someone who's a good strong AD carry.
I mean, fortunately for us, we have seen Prey and MadLife. That is a combination that we saw at All Stars in 2013 that was absolutely magnificent. I mean, if you remember, they pretty much just dumped. I mean, that All Stars tournament was just a slaughter in China for the Korean All-Star squad. And Prey and MadLife were insanely lane dominant. They got so many kills in the laning phase. They absolutely bodied everybody. So, I mean, if he had Prey, although you can also make the argument that at that time, right after Champions Winter,
Prey's in that level.
Prey was like an elite 80 carry at that time, and arguably, I think, the best in Korea at that moment. So, if we're talking about Prey after that, maybe they wouldn't have done quite so well. But we have seen MadLife instantly perform with an AD carry that he doesn't have experience with.
I've got one for you then, Monty. Here's the level of what I'm talking about. Let's say we gave him Arrow from the summer season of last year. So not a god, but a good player and a strong player as an AD carry, and someone potentially who you could make plays with potentially, right?
I think he would have done a lot better. I think that basically MadLife's skill in his prime would have only exponentially gotten better with the quality of his AD carry play. And fortunately enough, like I said, we did see that at All Stars. So I believe that kind of thing would have happened again, even if he had gotten somebody like Emperor from Blaze, because remember that the big theory going into the summer season in 2014 was CJ going to make a super team in order to try and actually make a deep run at Worlds? Now, they didn't end up doing that, but we could have had Emperor and MadLife then, and I think that would have been a pretty prime combination.
That also shows you, by the way, that MadLife did do something in a past life which he is now being punished for. Because, like I said, the guy's one of the greatest players of all time. He managed to have a legendary career regardless, but he never got the dominant Eddie carry. And then even when Riot forced them to merge the two teams, somehow the best Eddie carry on the team left the team to go to Brazil. So that's like at this point, there really is something. It's like, you know that scenario where you go back in time and you try and change things, but they always keep ending up like happening the same way anyway if there were different means. I feel like that's MadLife's career. But the reason I bring that topic up though is because he's already one of the top 10 players of all time. He's one of the greatest ever. And yet what makes him a bit unique actually is if you go through all those names on the top 10, a lot of those guys are going to either have lots of star players on their teams, like great teams they're on. And he was on a great team, but he didn't have lots of stars. Or more crucially, for certain roles, they're going to have a great player or a very great complementary player at a key position. So if they're a mid laner, they're going to have a player who works with their star extremely well and helps emphasize it, etc. Whereas actually, I think MadLife's a bit unique in as much as he almost succeeded in spite of this.
Like I said, he had nothing. He didn't have like a good jungle synergy with Templar in the laning phase. The one thing he did have was a fantastic team for team fighting. And also a teammates willing to follow up on his like ham engage moments and his like ham playmaking abilities. So that worked out in his favor, that's for sure. Nobody was timid about following him in. I think MadLife, he's one of those like cursed monkey paw characters where he like made a wish to have insane grab mechanics, but the caveat was, you know, the backlash is you'll never have a good AD carry.
Yeah. I've actually got a list like that one too of people who
Duncan's cursed monkey paw list.
I've got a list of people. He's one of them because that's the thing. It's the idea that he got the unattainable skill, but there's always the curse always affects you in a way you don't fully understand. You know, like or like you just walk out as he's saying like, and you'll get that, and you'll be like, yeah, and then as you're walking out, he'll be like, but beware, and you'll be like, oh, whatever, old bazaar seller. I've got the gift now, you know. So anyway, let me think. Okay, I've got a question for you. Oh, first of all, let me just set it up like this. One thing that's worth noting as well for people who weren't around in Season 2 is that people really did... if you listen to every pro player now, every single pro player in the world of League of Legends acknowledges Faker is a god. He's amazing, and if you ask them about Faker, they'll all have their story if they ever played him, and they'll say, oh, I did this, that. And even to pro players, he has that mythical status where they have him even a level above, okay? People really did have MadLife like that in Season 2, even though he's a support player. As in, like, other players who were superstar carries used to be like, no, MadLife's the best, and they'd all have their story of if they'd played him in a game and something he did, and or even, like, in a scrim, he did this against me, and, like, it blew my mind. Like, he really did have that status at the time in a way that no one else actually did.
He still does. I mean, what's funny is that even at IEM San Jose when I was there, when I was working with St. Vicious, I forget if it was the game we were casting or if whether we were on the desk or not, but on air, he was reminiscing about being dumpstered by MadLife. Like, and that's what he said. He's like, you know, I remember getting dumpstered by MadLife, and then he told a story, you know, of All-Stars and getting just destroyed.
Because what I want to ask by setting up that status there is, okay, I agree with you, actually. I think by now, when you just look at the body of Mata's work, Mata probably has overtaken him. Because interestingly, they have similar career stories. Mata always makes all these like semis. He's made a bunch of finals. Mata's obviously now won worlds as well. So Mata has the career accomplishments to have overtaken him. And also the level of play in a more competitive era, a higher mechanical era. Okay, all these factors. Mata has a lot going for him where you can make the argument he's better than MadLife. But actually, as an interesting question, when I think of other great support players through history, and I think of the greatest support players we have now, okay, Mata might have overtaken him, but at the moment, I can't see anyone on the horizon or anyone now who's going to overtake where MadLife is in terms of stature as like greatest support players. There's no one right now who looks like they're in line to become that next, you know.
I mean, not immediately. Not in the way, because if we compare Mata to MadLife too, you have to remember that Mata won champions in his rookie season, and by the end of that, people were already like starting to draw comparisons between Mata and MadLife, myself included, just because his rise was so explosive and his talent was obviously so great. And currently, I can't think of anybody that I would actively compare to Mata. I think in some of their best games, players like Gorilla and Wolf have shown glimmers of that, but it's been rare to see them compete at that same level.
And let me just add this caveat in here, Monty. Just on individual play, you could definitely make the case for Mate, regardless of what I'm about to say now. But Mate is the opposite story to what I just described on MadLife before.
Yeah.
He played with a super strong lane dominant AD carry and all-stars at almost every position for most of his career.
And also had Dandy, who was very effective at ganking his lane, unlike Cloud Templar.
I mean, when League of Legends is done, Monty, and everyone goes back and looks at all these Hall of Fames that we do, I guarantee you already, Mate is going to have the most ex-teammates in the Hall of Fame and in the top 10 players of all time. MadLife will have at most one, and that depends how the next couple of years go.
Yeah, and that I think depends very heavily on whether Shy can revive or not. And as we're sitting right now, here in January of 2015, Shy has played some great games, but we've got to see more.
Okay, so do you have a final, give me, if this was like the funeral, Monty, you need to leave them on a really poignant note or something. What would be the final word on MadLife's career for the Hall of Fame that we're putting him in now?
I think that it's just so important to note how MadLife defined what the support position was in a time when support players didn't have necessarily the resources that they have available now, and that how he changed the entire perception of the support role among fans and among his peers as pro gamers from that reactive protect the carry position to an active playmaking position, and his sense for engages, his sense for cooldown timers and making the critical plays at the right time and being able to single-handedly turn around great games with clutch mechanical plays and just insane game sense. And while other players may have eclipsed him in terms of playmaking ability or in terms of vision control, MadLife was really the innovator in that and was the first player, I think, to truly master that level of support play.
Okay, I'll just leave it on that note.